Hello and welcome to the supplemental lecture, giving you a little bit of historical context for our book Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. This PowerPoint is going to help you understand some of the things that were going on in the world at the time that the book was published, as we know that real life can inspire fiction, as it did with Agatha Christie and the case of the Armstrong baby and its parallels to the Charles Lindbergh kidnapping. So let's take a look at the cultural biases that were happening in this time period and what the world kind of looked like when Agatha Christie was writing her story. So some historical context. Murder on the Orient Express was published in 1934, so a couple years ago. It was an instant success. The book went on to be published in a bunch of countries that year, which was unusual because normally it had a small publishing locally before it earned enough money to make a more international publishing. So Agatha Christie was already so established, publishers just sent her books everywhere. It earned rave reviews and had a loyal following, as did many of her other novels. We know authors are influenced by the world around them. Their schemas are impacted in the same way that ours are. So let's take a look at what the world was experiencing when Agatha Christie decided to write this story. The 1930s were kind of a rough time, not just in England, not just in the US, but pretty much everywhere. So in the 1930s, if we take a look at the US, where the Armstrong case took place, and many of our characters are American, so we want to pay some attention to that culture as we go into our reading. So in the US, the Wall Street crash of 1929 had just happened, which caused the Great Depression, which is a huge time of upheaval and poverty and suffering in the US. The Dust Bowl also took place here. All of the agricultural farming in Middle America started to die out. Weather and climate weren't helping, and then the loss of all of the funding also took place. And so many people who were into farming had to move into the cities and created this idea of the dirty 30s, is what the 1930s was called, because all of these dirt farmers, is what they were called in the Middle American region, were moving into the cities and bringing the dirt with them, I guess. And so they called it the Dirty 30s. FDR was elected as president and began the New Deal programs to help restore the U.S. to prosperity. The New Deal, of course, as history has demonstrated, was wildly successful as it helped people work to regain their livelihoods and help bolster the economy as well. So the New Deal programs started to bring some hope, but they were just getting underway when Agatha Christie wrote her book. So the U.S. at this time was a pretty rough place. People were very insecure about their livelihoods, about if they'd have enough food to put on the table. It was a really difficult time. My grandma lived through the Great Depression, and to this day, she will have one bag of tea that she will make last for like 3 days, because tea was some very special thing then, because it was a luxury. You didn't need it. So if you had tea, you had to make it last because there just wasn't enough money to go around. The 1930s in Europe was also a challenging time. This is coming on the tail end of World War I. So in Europe, authoritarian regimes began to emerge in several countries, which was bad, as we find out when World War II starts. So the Third Reich in Germany started gaining popularity and elected Adolf Hitler as their leader. That didn't end well, as we know from history, because it caused genocide and World War II and millions of deaths. So the world was in some upheaval coming on the end of World War I. Germany was forced to pay reparations for World War I, pay to rebuild the countries that it had damaged. But they had lost the war. They had no money. And so they're in this place of economic insecurity. They're all feeling quite panicked. And so when a very strong and charismatic leader like Adolf Hitler came to the stage, they all just jumped on board with his very terrible, terrible ideas. In Italy, the dictator Benito Mussolini holds power and begins territorial expansion. If Adolf Hitler hadn't been the big bad guy of the time, Benito Mussolini would have taken that title. They're both absolutely garbage humans, just awful, awful people, caused a lot of deaths in their countries and the surrounding areas. Weaker states like Ethiopia, China, and Poland are being invaded by these expansionist powers, particularly Italy, Germany, those kind of countries. World War II begins in 1939, so we're ramping up to this World War II setting as we read through Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. So lots of the European countries not getting along with each other, and you can see some of that tension in the novel as well. There's a lot of cultural bias in the 1930s, of course, because humans just like to be biased. If you read Facebook today, you will also find that we've not moved beyond this cultural bias. We are very biased people. So cultural bias in the 1930s. The British were a post-colonial power. That means they used to have a lot of colonies, but now those colonies have gained independence. They are their own countries now. So many members of the British culture tended to look down on other countries because they used to own them. And so they thought they were superior to all of these places that they used to own. World War II had just ended. The world was reeling from it. England, as much as anyone, all of the countries came out damaged from World War I. Germany, of course, lost, and so they had to pay reparations, which built the framework for World War II as Adolf Hitler gained popularity. Austria-Hungary is, of course, hurting at this time. So is Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, including the Balkans and the Middle Eastern theater, which includes Syria, where our novel begins. All were having a difficult time on the tail end of World War I as well. So lots of upheaval and lots of feelings of superiority from the British toward other countries. If you take a look at this map real quick, everything that's in red used to be a colony at some point of Great Britain, of England. And so you can see anyone coming from any of the countries that were red, the British thought were inferior. They were not quite the same caliber of people. And you can read into that as you read through the novel and watch the characters interact with each other. The Middle East is interesting at this time period because now when we think of the Middle East, it is a place of upheaval. It's a dangerous place to be in many cases. But at this time, it was not so bad. The British held control of most of the Ottoman Mesopotamia, which includes Iraq, and the southern part of the Ottoman Syria, Palestine, and Transjordan areas you can see on the map here. And they controlled some of Turkey, Lebanon, Alexandria, lots of places in this area. Because these were partially colonies at the time, the Franco-Syrian War came to a head and took place during the 1920s between the Hashemite rulers and the newly established Arab Kingdom of Syria and France. The local Syrians ended up winning their independence for a brief time here, and this was kind of the golden age for Syria, where our novel begins. The Syrian Republic was a period in the history of Syria which lasted from 1930 to 1963, and the Treaty of Independence gave Syria its independence and ended official French rule. But the French, of course, refused to accept that, and there was some fighting and some difficulties. But because they just gained their independence, Syria was a nice place to be. They established a good government. Women at the time had way more freedoms than in many other places of the world. It was a safe place if you wanted to go be warm after spending all winter in rainy England. Syria was your vacation destination. It was a good place to be. People went there to take in the sun, to breathe fresh air. If they were ill, they went there to heal. Syria was a great place. It was one of the major destinations of choice if you were coming from Europe and you wanted to get someplace warm and relax and enjoy yourself. Syria is probably where you'd go, which is why our story starts there. Our train picks up a bunch of people along the way through this area of the world. And so when you think Syria, don't think the dangerous, scary place that comes to mind as we read the news now. But it was actually a very wonderful vacation destination many people took advantage of. For those of you who are visual learners like me, sometimes it helps to have a map. So if we take a look at the Simplon Orient Express train route, this route started in April 1919, and it takes a southerly route from Calais and Paris-Gare de Lyon to Milan, Venice, Trieste, Zagreb, Belgrade, Sofia, Istanbul, and a portion for Athens. So if you take a look at the green line, that's the Simplon Orient Express line, and you can see that it starts in Istanbul, and you're going to weave your way across the countries on your way to Paris here. And so our main character, Poirot, is taking the train to Paris, and then he's planning on getting a connection to London as he's been called back to work. You can see they're going to weave through many countries, though, going over the mountains where ultimately they do get stuck because of the snowfall. So lots of great points here. If you kind of want to visualize where the train's going, this map can help you do that. A free write exercise if you want to stretch your brain a little bit. I won't be collecting this. So if you want to write it and just enjoy it, fabulous. If you want to just ponder the question, also excellent. The setting of the novel involves a passage from Syria to London, with all the passengers on board having spent time in the Middle East. In today's world, widespread tourism to the Middle East is pretty unlikely. It's not the place we go if we want to relax. So contrast the social political climate of the country of Syria, Persia in 1933 with today. So you can see how the setting of the novel, it's important to understand the historical context, because if you're going into reading this novel thinking Syria 2019 version, you're going to have a very different feeling of where the characters are coming from than if you understand that Syria in 1933 was a very different place. Similarly, the cultural biases, you're wondering why Italians like to stab. It's just a normal thing everyone seems to be okay with. That's a cultural bias rooted in this time period. It's not something that you would hear people talk about now. So it's important to understand historical context, to understand what motivates our characters, and what makes them do the things they do, respond to people in the ways they respond, and have the kind of biases that are so deeply ingrained that innocent people could be convicted guilty. If you have any questions, of course, when you read through this PowerPoint and as you're finishing your book, feel free to reach out or talk to me in class. Have a great afternoon.